Senator from Vermont.
I call up amendment number 3738.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, for himself and others, proposes an amendment number 3738 to amendment number 3739.
I ask that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
Guys. Mr. President, this amendment, Tom. Mr. President, this amendment, which calls for transparency at the Fed, is frankly one of the more unusual amendments that I have ever participated in, not so much for its content, but for the kind of coalition that has come together around it. How often do you have the AFL-CIO and FreedomWorks supporting the same effort? How often are the SEIU, which is the largest trade union in this country, MoveOn.org, which has, I believe, some 5 million progressive members, Public Citizen, striving for the same goal as the National Taxpayers Union, or the Eagle Forum, or the Conservative Americans for Tax Reform? So I think this is a coalition representing tens of millions of grassroots activists. Some of them are progressive, come from where I come from. Some of them are conservative. But they are all united around the very basic principle. We need transparency at the Fed, and we need it now. And I want to use this opportunity and thank Chairman Dodd for allowing me to do this, to talk about the amendment, what it does, and why so many diverse groups are coming together in support of it. Because you do have to ask yourself, what brings together some of the most progressive groups in the country with some of the most conservative groups, some of the most progressive members of the Senate with some of the most conservative? I also want to tell you not only what this amendment does, but to clarify as best I can what it does not, because there has been some distortion in terms of about this amendment, and those distortions are blatantly untrue, and I want to touch on that also. I have to tell you, Mr. President, that the origin for this amendment came on March 3rd, 2009. And that was the date that, as a member of the Budget Committee, I had the opportunity of asking Chairman Bernanke what I thought was a pretty simple question. Chairman Bernanke obviously is chairman of the Fed. And what I asked him is, Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that the Fed has lent out some $2 trillion to some of the largest financial institutions in this country. Would you please tell me and the American people who received that money? And I thought that was a pretty simple and straightforward question. Mr. Bernanke said no, despite the fact that this was $2 trillion in zero interest or near zero interest loans. He apparently believes that the American people do not have a right to know who received that money. On that very same day, I introduced legislation requiring the Fed to put this information on its website, just as Congress required the Treasury Department to do with respect to the $700 billion TARP program. And here we are today. Whatever one may think of the TARP program, you can get information as to who received that money, when it was paid back, the details. It's right there on the Internet. And I believe that that same information should be made available in terms of the Fed zero and near zero interest loans. Mr. President, what the Fed apparently does not understand, and this is the important point, is that this money, these trillions of dollars, do not belong to the Fed. They belong to the American people. And it is incomprehensible to me, and I think to the overwhelming majority of the people in our country, that the Fed believes that they can keep this information secret. This amendment not only requires that the Fed tell us who has received the $2 trillion it lent out, but similar to the language incorporated in the House bill, it calls for an audit of the Fed by the GAO. And that's it, Mr. President. That's what we are attempting to do with this amendment. Transparency and a straightforward audit. Who got what, when, on what basis, on what terms, who was at the meetings, who made the decisions, and taking a look at possible conflicts of interest. Simple, factual questions that people from the state of Vermont ask me, I suspect people from Minnesota ask you, and people all over this country, regardless of their political persuasion, are asking. Mr. President, I understand that this amendment may not be supported by everyone. Some may suggest inaccurately that this amendment, and I quote from a statement, takes away the independence of the Federal Reserve and puts monetary policy into the hands of Congress. End of quote. That's one of the charges being made against this amendment. Let me address those concerns by simply reading to the members of the Senate exactly what is in the amendment so that we know what we're talking about. And I quote from page 4 of a 6-page amendment. It's not a long amendment. And this is what it says. Can't be clearer than this. Nothing in this amendment shall be construed as interference in or dictation of monetary policy to the Federal Reserve System by the Congress or the Government Accountability Office. End of quote. So if there are people who are saying, oh, we're going to get involved in monetary policy, oh, we're going to be politicizing the Fed, oh, we're going to have, before the election, Congress telling the Fed to raise interest rates, to lower interest rates, that is absolutely inaccurate. That is not what we're doing. That is not, in my view, what we should be doing. We want an independent Fed. We want them to develop monetary policy. That is not, underline not, what this amendment does. This amendment does not tell the Fed when to cut short-term interest rates and when to raise them. It does not tell the Fed what banks to lend money to and what banks not to lend money to. It does not tell the Fed what foreign central banks they can do business with and which ones it cannot do business with. It does not impose any new regulations on the Fed, nor does it take any regulatory authority away from the Fed. Let us be clear about that. Mr. President, what the opponents of this amendment are doing, I think, is equating independence with secrecy, and there is a difference. At a time when our entire financial system almost collapsed, we cannot let the Fed operate in secrecy any longer. The American people have a right to know. You know, I find it amusing for some people who oppose this amendment, as Chairman Dodd or the presiding officer knows, we have had heated debates on the floor of the Senate over a $5 million amendment, over an $8 million provision. Goes on for hours. And yet you got trillions of dollars being lent out, and there are some people who think the American people don't have a right to know who got that money. I think, frankly, that is absurd. The American people, we hear over and over again on the floor of the Senate, the American people play by the rules. That is what the average American family does. They play by the rules. Well, what are the rules governing the Fed? Who makes those rules? Or are they just made up as they go along, and they don't have to tell anybody about it? So I've got a problem with that, and that's what this amendment is about. Now, Mr. President, here, to my mind, and these are just my issues. Others may have different issues, and I'm sure they do. But here are just a few of the questions that the American people are asking and why we need a GAO audit of the Fed. These are just a few. Let me throw them out. Mr. President, why was Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, invited to the New York Federal Reserve to meet with federal officials in September of 2008 to determine whether AIG would be bailed out or allowed to go bankrupt. When the Fed and Treasury decided to bail out AIG to the tune of $182 billion, why did the Fed refuse to tell the American people where that money was going? Why did the Fed argue that this information needed to be kept secret, quote, as a matter of national security, end quote? Now, here's the point. When AIG finally released the names of the counterparties receiving this assistance, how did it happen that Goldman Sachs received $13 billion of this money? AIG, 182, $13 billion going to Goldman Sachs, 100 cents on the dollar of a company that was going bankrupt and that was bailed out. How's that? 100 cents on the dollar. Not bad. Did Goldman Sachs, another question that people might ask, did Goldman Sachs use this money to provide $16 billion in bonuses the next year? So here you have Goldman Sachs getting $13 billion out of the $182 billion that AIG got. The next year they're announcing $16 billion in bonuses. Did they use some of this money to provide those bonuses? A GAO audit of the Fed might help explain to the American people if there were any conflicts of interest surrounding this deal. Now, I think the average American would say, yeah, there's a conflict of interest. You got a guy from Goldman Sachs sitting in the room arguing for $182 billion. They got $182 billion. He gets $13 billion. Next year's company gives $16 billion in bonuses. Is there a conflict of interest? I think so. But that's what, my opinion isn't the important one here. That's what the GAO will be doing if this amendment is passed. Mr. President, just another question out there. In 2008, it seems to me, I may be wrong, but it seems to me, there was a conflict of interest at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, when Stephen Friedman, the head of the New York Fed, who also served on the board of directors of Goldman Sachs, so let's back it up, head of the Fed, serves on the board of Goldman Sachs, approved Goldman's application to become a bank holding company, giving it access to cheap loans from the Federal Reserve. Okay? Head of the Federal Reserve, New York Federal Reserve, on the board of Goldman Sachs, applying for Goldman Sachs to become a bank holding company to gain cheap loans from the Fed. Looks to me like there may be a conflict of interest, but what do I know? That's what we need a GAO report to tell us. But here is, interestingly enough, an article on May 9, 2009, in the Wall Street Journal. And let me quote briefly from that article. Quote, Goldman Sachs received speedy approval to become a bank holding company in September of 2008. During that time, the New York Fed's chairman, Stephen Friedman, sat on Goldman's board and had a large holding in Goldman stock, which, because of Goldman's new status as a bank holding company, was a violation of Federal Reserve policy. The New York Fed asked for a waiver, which, after about 2.5 months, the Fed granted. While it was weighing the request, Mr. Friedman bought 37,300 more Goldman shares in December. They've since risen $1.7 million in value. Mr. Friedman, who once ran Goldman, says none of these events involved any conflicts. End of quote. That's the Wall Street Journal, May 9, 2009. That's what Mr. Friedman says. Well, I kind of disagree with him, but I would like the GAO to take a look at that. Mr. President, without a comprehensive GAO report, we have to take Mr. Friedman at his word, and I don't think we should. Who got what? When did they get it? On what basis? On what terms? Who was at those meetings? Were there conflicts of interest? These are the kinds of questions that a GAO audit of the Fed will answer. Mr. President, as a result of the bailout of Bear Stearns and AIG, the Fed, and this is a beauty, I mean, this is really quite something. The Fed now owns credit default swaps. Listen up on this one. Now owns credit default swaps betting that California, Nevada, and Florida will default on their debt. So the Federal Reserve stands to make money if California, Nevada, and Florida go bankrupt. And I suspect that the senators from the great states of California, Nevada, and Florida would be rather interested to know that if their states go bankrupt, the Fed makes money. On the surface, this looks a little bit absurd to me, but again, I think this is an issue that the GAO might be taking a look at. Mr. President, it has been reported that the Federal Reserve pressured Bank of America into acquiring Merrill Lynch, making this financial institution even bigger and riskier, allegedly threatening to fire its CEO if the Bank of America backed out of this merger. When the merger went through, Merrill Lynch's employees received $3.7 billion in bonuses. Was this a good deal for the American taxpayer? A GAO audit can help us find out. Mr. President, when the Federal Reserve provided a $29 billion loan to J.P. Morgan Chase to acquire Bear Stearns, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, his name was Jamie Dimon, served on the board of directors at the New York Federal Reserve. Let's repeat that. When the Federal Reserve provided $29 billion to J.P. Morgan Chase, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase served on the board of directors of the New York Fed. Did this represent a conflict of interest? I think the average American would say yes. Maybe somebody has a different point of view, but I think a GAO audit can help explain all of this to the American people. Mr. President, currently, and I think we have to appreciate this as well, we have to shed some light on these issues. Currently, some 35 members of the Federal Reserve Boards of Governors are executives at private financial institutions which have received nearly $120 billion in TARP funds. But, Mr. President, we don't know how much these big banks received from the Fed. We know what they got from the TARP, not from the Fed. A GAO audit could answer this question. Mr. President, all of us, I believe all of us, are deeply concerned that small and medium-sized businesses around this country, I know it's certainly the case in Vermont, small and medium-sized businesses are begging for affordable credit. They have the opportunity to expand. We're beginning to see some economic recovery. They want to expand. They want to create new jobs. They are finding it extremely difficult to acquire those desperately needed affordable loans. Now, I find it as an important issue to ask how much of the trillions of dollars in zero or near zero interest loans that financial institutions receive from the Fed went out to those small businesses, or perhaps, as I personally believe is the case, were simply invested in federal government bonds earning an interest rate of 3 or 4%. What a number of observers believe, and the GAO can help us discover. Did the Fed provide zero interest loans to a large bank, which then took that money, bought government bonds for 3%? And if that was the case, and I suspect it was, you're looking at a huge scam. Huge scam. It's small and medium-sized businesses that need the money. That was the intention of these loans. But I don't know how much of this was invested in government bonds. You don't know, the American people don't know, and it is time that we found out. Mr. President, this amendment that I am offering is virtually identical to legislation that I've offered on this subject that has 33 co-sponsors. The amendment, I think, has 22. Democrats and Republicans. The original legislation had 33 co-sponsors. And just so that you can get a sense of the diversity of ideological opinion behind this amendment, let me tell you the names of the people who are on board the legislation, not the amendment, the legislation. That is Senators Barrasso, Bennett of Utah, Boxer, Brownback, Burr, Cardin, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Dorgan, Feingold, Graham, Grassley, Harkin, Hatch, Hutchinson, Inhofe, Isaacson, Landrieu, Leahy, Lincoln, McCain, Murkowski, Risch, Sanders, Thune, Vitta, Webb, Wicker, and Wyden. Those are people who are on the original legislation, 33 co-sponsors, and as you can see, they range from some of the most progressive members to some of the most conservative members. The amendment that is now on the floor has, I believe, 22 co-sponsors, Republicans and Democrats alike, and I want to thank all of them for their support. This is a real, the American people are asking, can people work together? Can they come together on important issues? If there is an important issue that people with different ideological backgrounds have come together on, this is that one. And I want to thank my Republican friends and my Democratic friends who every other day are fighting like cats and mice, but on this issue have come together, and I appreciate that. But it's not only the members of the Senate. Mr. President, in terms of progressive grassroots organizations, this amendment enjoys the strong support of the AFL-CIO, the Service Employees International Union, the single largest union in the country, the United Steelworkers of America, Public Citizen, the New American Foundation, Center for Economic Policy, the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, and Americans for Financial Reform, which is a coalition of over 250 consumer, employee, investor, community, and civil rights groups. Huge amount of support from the progressive community. And it also has a huge amount of support from the conservative community. Let me read briefly a letter that I received from the legislative director of the AFL-CIO. This is what he says. On behalf of the AFL-CIO, I am writing to urge you to support the Sanders, Feingold, DeMint, Leahy, McCain, Grassley, Vitta, Brownback amendment to increase transparency at the Federal Reserve. Working people want to know who benefited from the liquidity provided by taxpayers during the crisis, and this amendment will ensure that we receive this information. End of quote. I received another letter, which came from the president of SEIU, the president of the United Steelworkers, the president of Public Citizen, many other progressive groups, and this is what they say. Quote, since the start of the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve has dramatically changed its operating procedures. Instead of simply setting interest rates to influence macroeconomic conditions, it rapidly acquired a wide variety of private assets and extended massive secret bailouts to major financial institutions. There are still many questions about the Fed's behavior in these new activities. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded to more than $2 trillion, along with implied and explicit backstops to Wall Street firms that could cost even more. Who received the money? Against what collateral? On what terms and conditions? The only way to find out is through a complete audit of the Federal Reserve. That's why we support the Sanders, Feingold, DeMint, Leahy, McCain, Grassley, Vitta, Brownback amendment to increase transparency at the Fed. End of quote. That's from the SEIU, many other unions. Now, that is what some of the progressive groups that I frankly work with quite often, have to say about this amendment. But let me quote from some of the conservative organizations who, frankly, I usually do not have very good voting records with. Very often, they oppose what I bring forth. Here's the National Taxpayers Union. I don't know how many folks they have, but they are a big organization. This is what the National Taxpayers Union says, and I quote, the National Taxpayers Union urges all senators to vote yes on S. Amendment 3738 to the financial regulatory reform legislation. This amendment, introduced by Senators Sanders and DeMint, would require the Government Accountability Office to conduct an audit of the Federal Reserve. And I like their next sentence. This is what the next sentence is. Transparency is not a Democrat or Republican issue, but rather an issue of right or wrong. If the Senate insists on further expanding the Fed's reach, Americans deserve to know more about the workings of a government-sanctioned entity whose decisions directly affect their economic livelihood. A yes vote on S. Amendment 3738, this amendment, will be significantly weighted as a pro-taxpayer vote in our annual rating of Congress, end of quote. That means I may have at least a 1% approval vote from the National Taxpayers Union, and I appreciate their support. That's from the National Taxpayers Union. Let me quote from another letter of support I received from a group of conservative organizations that includes the Americans for Tax Reform, the Campaign for Liberty, the Rutherford Institute, the Eagle Forum, Freedom Works, and the Center for Fiscal Accountability. Again, some of the more conservative groups in this country, groups that usually do not support my initiatives. This is what they say, quote, "We urge you to vote for Senator Sanders, Feingold, DeMint, and Vitter's Federal Reserve Transparency Amendment. This amendment does not take away the quote-unquote independence of the Fed. It simply requires the GAO to conduct an independent audit of the Fed and requires the Fed to release the names of the recipients of more than $2 trillion in taxpayer-backed assistance during this latest economic crisis. Any true financial reform effort will start with requiring accountability from our nation's central bank." And let me, end of quote. And let me thank all of the conservative groups, in this case the Americans for Tax Reform, the Campaign for Liberty, and the others, for their very strong grassroots effort in supporting this amendment. It is an indication, again, that on certain issues, progressives and conservatives can come together. Mr. President, let me mention this, because I think it's possible that some of the members don't know this. Madam President, I am sorry. Presidency changed while I was speaking again. This amendment is not a radical idea. As part of the budget resolution debate in April of 2009, the Senate voted overwhelmingly in support of this concept by a vote of 59 to 39. I brought that up. It was a non-binding vote, part of the budget resolution, 59 to 39. So many senators have already gone on record in supporting that. And here is also an important piece of information. In the House of Representatives, this concept passed the House Financial Services Committee by a vote of 43 to 26 and was incorporated into the House version of the Wall Street Reform Bill that was approved by the House last December. So again, what we are talking about is something that was passed in the House, and it is in the House bill. There's a variation. We're not the same, to be honest. But the same concept for a Fed audit already exists in the Wall Street Reform Bill passed in the House. This concept has the support of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who has said that Congress should ask the Fed to put this information, quote, on the Internet like they've done with the recovery package and the budget, end of quote. That's exactly what this amendment would do. This concept has already, now here's another point. Many people don't know this. A lot of this language is in the House bill. A lot of this language has already been supported in the Senate last year as part of the budget resolution. But here's an important point that many people don't know. Bloomberg News Service did a very good job. And they have aggressively demanded, as a news organization, that this information about who the Fed lent money to be made public. And as a result of their efforts, 2 federal courts, not one, 2 federal courts, have ordered the Fed to release all the names and details of the recipients of more than $2 trillion in Federal Reserve loans since the financial crisis started, as a result of a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. So Bloomberg News filed suit. 2 federal courts supported Bloomberg. Mr. President, the Fed had argued in court, in opposition to Bloomberg, that it should not have to release this information, citing, according to Reuters, quote, this is what the Fed said, quote, an exemption that it said lets federal agencies keep secret various trade secrets and commercial or financial information, end of quote, from the Fed. However, the U.S. Court of Appeals in New York disagreed. Here is what a unanimous 3-judge appeals court panel wrote in their opinion. Unanimous 3-judge appeals court. Quote, to give the Fed power to deny disclosure because it thinks it best to do so would undermine the basic policy that disclosure, not secrecy, is the dominant objective. If the board believes such an exemption would better serve the national interest, it should ask Congress to amend the statute." End of quote. Mr. President, this appeals court decision upheld an earlier ruling by the Southern Federal District Court of New York that also ordered the Fed to release this information. In other words, Mr. President, we now have 59 senators who, as part of the budget resolution, voted on this issue, 320 members of Congress, the House, 2 U.S. courts that have all told the Fed in no uncertain terms, give us transparency. That's what we've got. Mr. President, as I wind down and conclude my remarks, let me just simply say that I thank very much all of the support, all the grassroots support from progressive and conservative groups and from my fellow senators. The American people have a right to know when trillions of their dollars are being spent and who got it. The American people have a right to know whether there are conflicts of interest. Mr. President, I would ask my colleagues, there are so many co-sponsors, I want to mention them all, but I just want to thank all of them. Let me just conclude by saying that I am very proud to say that we have been working with Senator Dodd's office and some other offices, and I'm going to ask that my amendment be modified with the changes that are at the desk. And I'm proud to say that these modifications have been worked out by with Senator Dodd and would allow the GAO to conduct a top-to-bottom audit of all of the Federal Reserve's emergency lending activities since December 1st, 2007. In addition, the modifications require the Fed to put on its website all of the recipients of over $2 trillion in emergency assistance since December 1st, 2007.